If you feel pressure to respond immediately in conversations at work, the issue is usually not your knowledge, it's your timing. Because when you respond too quickly, you often give a partial answer, an unclear answer, or an answer you later want to change. And that can affect how confident or credible you sound. The goal is not to answer faster. The goal is to control the moment before you respond. A lot of professionals think silence looks unprepared. So they fill in the space. They start speaking while still thinking. That is usually when clarity drops. A better approach is much simpler. You want 5 parts: pause, acknowledge, frame, think, respond. That is the structure. Give yourself a moment. Acknowledge the question. Frame your response. Think clearly, then answer. If you do that well, you can take time to think without sounding unsure. So let's make this practical. The first part is pause. This is where you give yourself a brief moment before speaking. Not long silence, just enough space to stop reacting. A useful question to ask yourself here is, am I about to respond too quickly? Another one is, do I need a second to organize my thoughts? That matters because most rushed answers come from reacting instead of thinking. So in this section, your job is to create space. That can sound like, let me think about that for a second. Or, that's a good question. Or, give me a moment to walk through that. That is enough. You are creating time without losing control. The second part is acknowledge. This is where you show that you understand the question or the situation. And this part matters because silence without acknowledgement can feel uncertain. A useful question to ask yourself here is, what is the question really asking? Another one is, what is the focus of this conversation? That keeps you grounded because strong communicators do not just answer, they show alignment first. So in this section, your job is to reflect the question clearly. That can sound like, so you're asking about the timeline for this phase? Or, it sounds like the focus is on how this will affect delivery. Or, you're looking at how this connects to the overall plan. Now, the conversation feels aligned. The third part is frame. This is where you set up how you're going to answer. And this part matters because it gives structure before content. A useful question to ask yourself here is, how can I organize this answer clearly? Another one is, what is the simplest way to walk through this? That helps you avoid rambling. Because once you frame your answer, your thinking becomes easier to follow. So, in this section, your job is to guide the listener. That can sound like, there are 2 parts to this. Or, I'll walk through this in steps. Or, let me break this down quickly. Now, your answer has direction. The fourth part is think. This is where you take the moment you created and actually use it. And this part matters because buying time only works if you use that time well. A useful question to ask yourself here is, what is the main point I need to communicate? Another one is, what matters most in this answer? That keeps your response focused because the goal is not to say everything. It's to say what matters clearly. So in this section, your job is to organize your thinking before you speak fully. The fifth part is respond. This is where you give your answer. And this part matters because now your answer is more structured and controlled. A useful question to ask yourself here is, am I answering clearly and directly? Another one is, did I stay aligned with the question? That keeps your communication strong because your response now reflects clarity, not urgency. That can sound like, based on where we are, the timeline is still holding with one area we are tracking closely. Or, This connects to delivery in two ways: timing and sequence. Or, the main factor here is how this impacts the next phase. Now, your answer sounds steady. So, when you put the 5 parts together, it becomes much easier to manage real time conversations. Pause, create space. Acknowledge, show alignment. Frame, organize the answer. Think, focus your message. And respond, deliver clearly. That is the structure. And it works because it keeps you away from two common mistakes. The first is rushing. That is when you speak before your thinking is ready. The second is rambling. That is when you keep talking while trying to find your answer. You want the middle, controlled and clear. For example, that's a good question. Let me think about that for a second. You're asking about how this affects the timeline. There are 2 parts to this. First, the current phase is still on track. Second, we're watching one dependency that could affect the next stage. That works because the response is easy to follow. It creates space. It aligns the question. It structures the answer and it delivers clearly. Another mistake professionals make is assuming they have to answer immediately to appear confident. That usually creates the opposite effect. Confidence comes from clarity, not speed. Now, this matters even more in high pressure conversations because that is when people feel the strongest need to respond quickly. The same framework still works. You do not need to speak faster. You need to manage the moment better. For example, let me take a second and think through that. You're asking how this impacts delivery. I'll break it into 2 parts. The current timeline is holding, and we're tracking one area closely that could affect the next phase. That sounds composed, and it gives you time without losing control. So, if you want a practical way to buy yourself time to think in a conversation, ask yourself 5 questions. Do I need a moment before I respond? What is the question really asking? How can I structure this clearly? What is the main point I need to make? Am I answering directly? Then, check 5 things before you finish speaking. Did I create space before responding? Did I show alignment with the question? Did I frame my answer clearly? Did I stay focused on what matters? And did I respond in a controlled way? That is the goal. Not a faster answer, a clearer one. Because strong communication is not about speed. It's about control.